Every day, more than 16 billion searches happen on Google. People looking for answers, looking for clarity, looking for who they are. And one of the most asked questions is about identity. Not just the word, but what it means. Who am I? What defines me? How do I know? We're searching for ourselves online like never before, and we're hoping that Google will have the answer, and it might have the answer we can't find from within. Did you know that the word identity comes from the Latin word idem, meaning the same? And up until the 90s, that's what identity meant: sameness, the state of being the same person over time, unchanging, consistent. But then a psychologist named Erik Erikson recasted the word. He started using it to describe how an individual forms their sense of self in relation to society, and the meaning shifted, and it shifted fast. By the 1960s, identity no longer meant sameness. It meant the opposite. What makes you distinct? What makes you unique? And what sets you apart from everyone else? The Oxford Dictionary definition today states it as the characteristics, feelings, or beliefs that make people different from others. So the word went from meaning the same to meaning different in less than a generation. And that shift happened at a very specific moment. Cue post-war Britain, a time of rebuilding, rationing, the welfare state promising collective identity through institutions like the NHS. But at the same time, consumer culture was blooming, especially heavily influenced by America. The youth culture was emerging in the UK, and Erikson's work spread quickly through psychology and popular culture. People wanted to feel individual in a society that was trying to rebuild collective identity. So the word identity, which used to mean sameness, got repurposed to mean the opposite, individuality. The first passports were issued in the early 1900s. These documents were designed to prove you were the same person as the photo, to identify you. Before the 90s, identity wasn't really something individuals spent much time thinking about. You were who your family said you were, who your community said you were, who your role in society were. But once that shift happened, once identity became individuality, the meaning changed. The man's desire to discover their who I am question began. Now identity is everywhere, and it includes the roles we hold in relationships like child, friend, partner, parent, and accomplishments, education and career, external characteristics over which we have little control over: height, race, social, economic class and political opinions, moral attitudes, religious beliefs, all of which guide the choices we make on a daily basis. Identity is complicated. Part of it is fixed, like your age or gender, but part of it is how you think of yourself, who you feel you are, and whether that stays the same over time. But some identities, some labels, people actively resist. Many people who've experienced violence, sexual abuse, grooming, trauma, choose not to share their experiences, not always because of shame, but because they've made a conscious decision that they don't want it to become part of their identity. That's not what they want to be known for. And research backs this up. It shows that on average it takes 17 years before someone with lived experience of sexual abuse or violence discloses their experience. And one of the reasons, they don't want to be defined by it. They don't want the trauma to stain their self-representation. They resist the stigmatizing labels. They fear the judgment, the pity, the way people will see them differently. Because once you say it, once you disclose, there's a risk to that individual that survivor becomes who they are, that the trauma becomes their identity. Which raises the question, if identity is partly fluid, partly negotiable, partly shaped by others, and some identities we resist entirely, then who gets to decide who we are. We're living in a moment of obsession with identity. It's never been more important to know who you are. But at the same time, it's never been more difficult. One expert described it as a response to that conformity, a kind of rebellion against the oppression of identity. And that makes sense. The desire to explore yourself, to reflect on who you are, to seek recognition and affirmation, especially if you've been marginalized. That's legitimate. Authenticity as a moral ideal is perfectly good. You want to be true to yourself and comfortable in your own skin. And there's a famous Australian cricketer, Shane Warne. He once said, even though I've got everything and I've been so successful, I don't really know who I am. And that sums up the identity angst of our time. There's this weird obsession with personal identity. We're more obsessed with knowing who we are than ever before, and somehow more uncertain about it at the same time. And the obsession feeds itself. We're more connected globally than ever before, and so identity labels become a way for people to find like-minded others easily. Giving something a name helps it to be discussed. But over-focusing on our uniqueness means we think more about rebranding than transformation. The obsession with self-labeling leads to shallowness and self-absorption, which become more interested in image, appearance, and social currency than self-realization. It's been described as a hyper-individual society trying to overcompensate for something, as if we're fragments of full selves, fabricating our existence piecemeal with labels and subcultures. And maybe that's why we're so drawn to personality tests. Tests like Myers-Briggs, DISC, Human Design, Enneagram, Strengths Finders, and so on. We answer the questions, we wait for the results, and when they come back, we feel something. Relief, maybe. Like, finally, here it is. Here I am, confirmed. It's official. I'm real. But I've started to notice how often I take these types of tests. And every time I take one, I'm looking for something. Confirmation of who I am. I wanted something outside of me to tell me who I am, to make me official, to make me certain. Because somewhere along the way, before I ever took a personality test, I stopped trusting that I already knew. But then if I didn't yet know or understand what self-trust is, then I couldn't have stopped, right? Greetings. This is Like Me Officially podcast, and I'm JK. And this is where raw truths meet reflection, where I challenge social narratives, explore self-efficacy, and move beyond surviving into thriving. Because if you're anything like me, you'll recognize that life is for living and living freely. Hashtag our time to thrive. To understand why I keep searching, I have to go back to when it started. The questioning of identity didn't start with a personality test. It started much earlier for me. I knew I was a sister, a daughter, a cousin, and friend. I knew I was shy. I knew I liked to read and to fix things that were broken. I liked to write and knit and sew and sing and play the guitar. I knew because when I was introduced or described to someone, what I liked to do was also added after my name. But even then, I was searching. I would spend hours at my local library reading, not always for school, just searching for answers to questions not yet formed, searching for a representation, a direction, something. The librarians all knew me. Primary school, secondary school. The library was escapism for the mind, for my mind, and a place to feel safe for a while. Words can be like water to parched soil, giving life to seeds to grow. Words can give life or death to the soul. Being groomed, experiencing sexual violence and violence, having someone put words, deliberately calculated words, to make me question my own thoughts, to make me question my own thinking that I didn't have the capacity to understand. It was confusing. My little world, in my developing brain, didn't understand much, but it understood a lot. Those words and terms got in. They embedded themselves in my in my mind, in my body. They became part of my internal voice. And it's not just abusers who have this ability. Magazines, media, images, language, all of it questioning who you are, telling you what you should be, what you should look like, how you should feel, what makes you acceptable, telling you to be authentic, and in the same breath, tell you who to be. And in all that noise, all of those external voices telling me who I should be, what I should look like, how I should feel, I felt a resistance to it all. Partially because I didn't want to be told how to feel or be, and partly because those directions in time translated into dark thoughts towards myself and my body that took me onto a path of self-harm. I kept looking for something to help break this, and I did, in the most unexpected place, the Bible. The word surprisingly gave me insight I'd never considered. Choice, agency, that I was loved, seen and known. I had a place not because I had earned it, but because it was my birthright. It told me I could heal, could get better, that I wasn't broken. That became an anchor. It helped encourage me to see and embrace the truth of me, and it's given me a place to return to again and again. But before I found that anchor, the external voices had already done their damage. They had become louder than my internal one, and over time, I stopped trusting my own knowing, which is where the personality tests come in. The first time I took the Myers-Briggs type indicator test was at work. I think it was my second job. I had no context going in, no preparation. Just a facilitator, a room full of colleagues, and a questionnaire. I answered the questions honestly, handed it in, waited for the results. And when they came back, when the facilitator started explaining what my type meant, I felt myself shrink, not metaphorically, physically. I felt smaller in my chair. I felt everyone's eyes on me, and I felt the room get bigger. And those eyes, they didn't look curious. They were judging eyes. It's like they could see me, and I felt ashamed. I felt vulnerable. And it was like they had language for what was wrong with me. Like now they had permission to put me in a box and label it. I left that room feeling like I was the problem. Like who I am intrinsically and fundamentally wasn't right. That experience still feels real to me, even now. I can still feel the weight of it, the shame of it, the sense that something about me had been exposed, was off, and found lacking. And yet, despite that, I kept taking tests. Different ones in different contexts, like human design, which told me I'm a projector. The DISC test, which sorted me into a behavioral style, and Strengths Finder, one of my favorites, which gave me language for what I do well. And other tests, some random, some not so random, gave me colors and archetypes and numbers to confirm who I think or thought I was. And some of them felt better than that first experience. Some of them felt like relief. But I started to notice a pattern, not in the results, but in me. I wasn't just curious, I was searching. And the thing I was searching for wasn't insight, it was validation. I wanted something outside of me to confirm that who I am is okay, that I'm not broken, that there's a category I fit into where I'm not the problem. Because somewhere deep underneath all the tests, all the results, all the labels, there's a question I've been asking for a long, long time. Am I allowed to know myself without someone else confirming it? Can I be me without being criticized and judged? Because when you're 13 years old and you tell your mother that you've been sexually abused, and her first response is, "Are you sure?" Because once you say this, you can't take it back. Something changes, not just in what you believe about the world, but in what you believe about yourself. Because the question underneath her question wasn't, "Are you sure this happened?" It was, "Are you sure you're telling the truth?" And when the person who's supposed to know you better than anyone questions whether you're being honest about your own experience, you start questioning. But it didn't start there, because when your abuser tells you who you are, with words said with the intention to control and manipulate your thinking and make you dependent on them, words that have affected me then and still affect me to this day, the fracture started much earlier. The abuser didn't just harm my body, they rewrote my sense of self. They told me who I am, what I deserved, what I'm worth. And because I was young, because I didn't yet have the tools to resist, those words got in. They embedded themselves. They became part of my internal voice, part of the doubt. And so when my mother questioned me, when the police process ended with a not guilty verdict, it wasn't the first time someone had told me that my truth doesn't matter. It was just the most public confirmation of something I'd already been conditioned to believe. And when I did make the formal police report, I gave my statement. I went through the process, and at the end of it, the abuser, stroke paedophile, was found not guilty. Not innocent, not guilty, which legally means the same thing, but emotionally it doesn't, because what I heard in that verdict wasn't the evidence was insufficient. What I heard was your truth wasn't enough. And when your truth isn't enough, when the thing you know happened is questioned, dismissed, or ruled against, the sense of self fractures even more. It's like getting a tiny hole in your tights that quickly turns into a large, long ladder. You can't stop it getting worse. I stopped knowing what I know. I stopped trusting what I felt. And I started looking outside myself for someone or something to tell me what's real. It's one of the ways I survived. A personality test can't tell you that you were abused, but it can tell you that you're an INFJ or a projector, or that your primary strength is empathy. And in that moment, when the result comes back and the description feels real, there's relief. Not because the label is accurate, but because something has confirmed me. Something outside of me said, yes, this is who you are. And for someone whose sense of self was questioned early, whose identity was shaped by an abuser's words, dismissed by a mother's doubt, and ruled against by a legal system, that confirmation feels like oxygen. Even when the test itself made me feel small, even when it was weaponized in a room full of people, I kept going back to it because the need to be seen, to be known, to have who I am validated by something external was much stronger than the shame. And it's not surprising that I've looked to get validation from people and systems that know more about me than I do. It's called survival. But even knowing it's survival, I wanted to understand what I was actually searching for. So I started looking into where these tests came from. I wanted to answer some questions, like who created the test and why, and do these tests do more harm than good? Because I feel the origins tell a story, and I think that story and that context matters. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the most popular personality test in the world, taken by more than 2 million people every year and translated into more than 30 languages, was created by a mother and daughter duo. Catherine Cook Briggs, the mother, Isabel Briggs Myers, the daughter. They had no background in psychology, psychometrics, or statistics. They built it on Carl Jung's 1921 work on personality types, but crucially they began creating their indicator during World War II in the belief that knowing personality preferences would help women entering the industrial workforce identify the sorts of wartime jobs that would be most comfortable and effective for them. It started as a workplace sorting tool, not a path to self-knowledge, and not a tool for understanding the complexity of human identity. It was a sorting mechanism for labour. In 1957, they sold the indicator to a psychometric test publisher, and the theory became marketable. The assessment soon caught on with employers looking for inexpensive standardized tests to match workers to jobs. And today, despite its popularity, the MBTI has been widely regarded as pseudoscience by the scientific community. Psychologist Adam Grant, for example, has called it the fad that won't die. Psychometric specialist Robert Hogan has written that most personality psychologists regard the MBTI as little more than an elaborate Chinese fortune cookie. DISC is another one, and that was built on the work of psychologist William Moulton Marston in the 90s, and that, incidentally, is the same man who created the lie detector test and Wonder Woman. DISC sorts people into 4 behavioral category styles: D, dominance; I, influence; S, steadiness; C, compliance. It's used widely in workplaces for team building and communication training. Then there's human design. That's the system that told me I'm a projector, and it has its roots in astrology, the I Ching, Kabbalah, and the chakra system. It was developed in the 90s by a man named Raoul Hu, who claimed to have received information during a mystical experience on the island of Ibiza. And then there's the Enneagram, which is much older and has stranger roots. Its contemporary approaches are principally derived from the teachings of Oscar Icazo from the 1950s and Chilean psychiatrist Claudio Naranjo from the 1970s. The symbol itself traces back to a 4th century Christian mystic, then through a secretive spiritual movement, then through South American psychologists, before landing in California therapy circles and eventually the mainstream. The Enneagram has been dismissed by personality assessment experts as another pseudoscience with limited formal psychometric analysis. And most studies have found that scores on the individual MBTI scales are actually distributed in a centrally peaked manner. So that means the majority of people lie near the middle of a continuous curve and not at the poles. The test forces a binary where none exists, which is partially or partly why results change. It's an indication that you're not inconsistent, the test is inadequate. These systems aren't built on empirical research, they're built on observation, intuition, and spiritual frameworks. And then they're presented and sold as tools for understanding who you are. And more questions. I have more questions, because if these tests were created for sorting workers, mystical revelation, for categorizing people into types that don't account for growth or change, then what happens when we use them to answer the question, who am I? What happens when a facilitator hands you a result in a room full of colleagues and suddenly you feel smaller, judged, boxed in? And I'm not saying the tests are useless, I'm saying that context matters, because these tests feel real, they feel accurate, and there's a reason for that. It's called the Barnum effect. In 1948, psychologist Bertram Forer gave 39 students a personality test. He told them he would give each one a personalized analysis. When he handed back the results, he asked them to rate how accurate the description was. The average rating was 4.3 out of 5. Then he revealed that every single student had received the exact same description, assembled from an astrology book filled with vague, positive, generic statements that could apply to almost anyone. We feel seen by these tests, not because they're seeing us, but because they're designed to feel that way. A psychologist has written that when you read the basic descriptions, they're all written in a positive way. They're generic. So people then say, oh, it totally applies to me. The Barnum effect explains why bad personality tests feel good. We have a fundamental human need to understand ourselves and feel understood by others. The Barnum effect provides a shortcut to this feeling of validation. That's it, a shortcut to the feeling of being known. And the need to feel seen, to feel understood, isn't trivial, it's fundamental, especially when who you are was questioned early. Once I understood the Barnum effect, once I saw how we're designed to feel seen by vague descriptions, I started noticing manipulation everywhere, not just in tests, in language itself. I've started to better understand and better discern the words of manipulation which we're surrounded by on a daily basis. I want to know the truth of the words and terms being used, not just accept them because they sound official, scientific, or even helpful. I suppose that's why I try to break things down in these episodes. It's the only way I can remain a critical thinker in a space that traditionally wants me to feel and live as a survivor forever. I don't want to be a slave to an experience, and I want to understand how I can unlearn what I've learned if it doesn't serve me. Because language has power, and the people who create the language, who create the tests, the labels, the categories, they have power too. When a workplace uses a personality test to assess fit, to justify decisions about hiring or promotion or team dynamics, who benefits from that language? Who gets sorted? Who gets boxed in? When a facilitator hands you a result in a room full of colleagues and suddenly you feel smaller, judged, exposed, whose truth are you accepting? Theirs or yours? When the test tells you that you're this type, this color, this energy, and the description feels accurate because it's designed to feel that way, are you learning who you are, or are you learning to accept someone else's definition of you? I'm not saying the tests are inherently malicious. I'm just saying that again, that context matters, the origins matter, the language matters, because when you've been manipulated by an abuser's words, when language has been used to control you, to shape your thinking, to make you dependent, you learn to listen differently. You learn to ask, whose voice is this? Whose agenda is this? Whose truth is this? And you learn to break things down, to question, to discern, not because you're cynical, but because you refuse to hand over your sense of self to anyone or anything ever again. And when I started understanding the neuroscience behind all of this, why my brain kept searching for external confirmation, it made even more sense. The brain is designed to remember pain, not as cruelty, but as survival. The amygdala, your brain's threat detector, tags betrayal memories as survival critical. And research shows that recalling personal betrayals triggers 50% stronger amygdala activation than other negative memories. Betrayal sparks cortisol spikes 3 times higher than routine stressors. And when your amygdala gets stuck in overdrive, it sends constant danger signals. This isn't weakness. This is biology. Your body is trying to protect you. But when the threat was early, when the person who harmed you was someone close, someone trusted, the brain doesn't just remember the harm, it questions the self. And research on childhood sexual abuse shows that survivors often experience disrupted self-concept clarity. The sense of who you are, your inner certainty about your own identity gets shaken at a foundational level. When childhood sexual abuse happens, it damages the ability to engage in the identity work of childhood. Adults raised in neglectful or abusive environments weren't taught their own value and worth. Instead, many were conditioned to seek out external validation from people who reinforced that they were never good enough. So, when a personality test offers a label, it's offering something that was taken from you early. Certainty, confirmation, the feeling of being known. And even when the test itself is flawed, even when the result shifts, the next time you take it again and again. You keep going back because the need is real. So if the test gives different answers at different points in one's life, then what is it actually measuring? And if identity isn't fixed, if personality traits fluctuate, then what does it mean to know yourself? René Motis, a psychologist, said, "We're not the same person for the whole of our life." And Professor David Gilbert, a Harvard psychology, he said that human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. Wow. And the research shows that personality is both continuous and changing. New roles bring different goals, new ways of thinking. If repeatedly experienced, these become habitual, we can deeply change ourselves in a positive, lasting way. So, when the result shifts, it's not because you're inconsistent, it's because you're alive and growing. But if you're using the test to answer the question, who am I? Then the shift in result feels destabilizing, because the question underneath isn't actually what type am I? The question is, am I allowed to know myself without someone else confirming it? And deeper still, is who I am fixed, or am I allowed to change? And here's a reality check. This whole search, the tests, the labels, the going back for confirmation, it's not really about identity. It's about trust. It's about self-trust. When you've been told who you are by an abuser, when your truth has been questioned by the people who were supposed to believe you, when your sense of self was fractured early and never properly put back together, you stop trusting your own thinking. You stop believing that what you feel is real, that what you know is valid, that who you are is enough. And so you look outside to a test, to a system, to a label, to anything that will confirm what you're no longer sure of on your own. The test isn't really the problem, neither is the search. The problem is that somewhere along the way, I stopped trusting myself. And I've been looking for something external to replace that truth ever since. And here's what I'm learning. No test can give me self-trust. No label can restore what was taken when someone told me that I was lying about my own experience, that no one would believe me. No result, no matter how accurate it feels, can replace the work of learning to trust your own knowing again. And something else I'm learning, identity can be as confusing and complicated as I choose to make it. We live in a culture obsessed with identity, with labels, with finding ourselves, with branding ourselves, with having our uniqueness validated by others. And all of that, the tests, the categories, the constant searching, we're choosing that complexity, or at least we're participating in it, not maliciously, but because we've been conditioned to look outside for answers, because the culture tells us identity is something we need to discover, perform, and have confirmed by someone else. But what if it doesn't have to be that complicated? What if the answer is simpler than the hundreds of questions we keep asking? I still take personality tests, not as often as I used to, just sometimes. And when I do, I notice something different now. I'm not looking for the result to tell me who I am. I'm looking at it like a mirror, something that reflects back a pattern, something that opens a door to a conversation with myself and asks, what's changed? Have I grown? What area would I or could I improve in? The test isn't the authority. I am. And I'm learning to differentiate, to know when a tool is being used well and when it's being misused. Because these tests do have their place when used properly, not to exclude people, not to label them as the problem, but to understand communication styles, team dynamics, and strengths. They can be useful as one piece of information among many, but they should never be used to make you feel smaller. What happened to me in that room where the facilitator handed me a result and I felt myself shrink, felt the eyes judging me, felt exposed, vulnerable, and labelled as the problem? That was misuse. That was the tool becoming a weapon. And learning to differentiate between those two things, between a tool used well and a tool misused, has been part of rebuilding my self-trust. The other part has been this, remembering that I'm meant to grow and evolve. And like the psychologist Renee Motis says, we're not the same person for the whole of our life. And human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. And that's from Daniel Gilbert. And learning to trust that, to know that who I was at 20 isn't who I am at 30. And who I am at 30 isn't who I'll be at 50. And so on and so on. That's been liberating because it means the label doesn't define me. The result doesn't limit me. The test doesn't know where I'm going. Only I do. That shift didn't happen because I decided to stop taking tests. It happened because I started doing something harder. I started trusting my own knowing, and I made a decision not to take a test from a victim or survivor mindset, but from a place of curiosity. After all, I'm a thriver. And part of that has been learning to discern manipulation, to question language, to break things down. Not all at once, not perfectly, but in small moments. Choosing my own yes, choosing my own no, noticing what feels true in my body rather than waiting for something outside to confirm it, and asking, whose voice is this? Whose agenda is this? Whose truth is this? Refusing to accept a label just because it sounds official. Refusing to live as a survivor forever just because the traditional narrative expects it. Looking inward first before looking outward. Not rejecting the tools, but knowing when they're being used well and when they're not. Knowing that I'm allowed to grow, to change, to evolve. And knowing that no test, no matter how popular, no matter how widely used, can tell me who I'm becoming. Only I can do that. And research on trauma recovery shows that when validation injuries are healed, when a person starts taking in healthy validation moments, they emotionally learn what it's like to be recognized and accepted for who they are. In time, this builds their own sense of self-validation so they can feel okay in themselves regardless of how others perceive them. They move away from an insatiable hunger for external validation towards a sense of inner grounded validation as they begin to rely on themselves, not on other people's approval. They connect to their own inner world, their own wisdom, gut feeling, creative intuition, instincts. They become more authentic in their expressions and their life expands. That's the moment. That's the movement. Not from test to no test. From needing the answer to come from outside to trust in the answer that already lives inside. From external validation to self-trust. From accepting the language handed to you to breaking it down and discerning the truth of it. From living as a survivor forever to choosing how you define yourself to looking inward first. From making identity as complicated as the culture wants it to be to choosing simplicity. Choosing to trust what you already know. So, if you're like me, if you've taken the test, saved the results, gone back for confirmation, and taken more tests, and whether they're random or professionally organized, I'm not here to tell you to stop. I'm here to remind you to look inward first, to know that these tests have their place, but that place isn't to define you. It's not to limit you. It's not to replace your own knowing. Learn to differentiate between a tool used well and a tool misused. And remember, you're meant to grow, to evolve, to change. Identity can be as confusing and as complicated as you choose to make it. I'm still learning to choose simplicity, which means self-inquiry when the urge comes upon me to do something that seeks validation. I look within to see what part of me needs to be nourished and why. Some days and seasons are easier than others, but I'm learning to trust who I am now and who I'm becoming. Thank you for listening to this episode of Like Me Podcast. If anything I've shared has made you stop, think, or see yourself just a little bit clearer, fantastic. I love this for you. I love this for me. And honestly, I love this for us. And if this episode shifted something in you, give yourself a moment to sit with it. And if anything felt a little bit too heavy, speak to someone you trust. What I've learnt is that we don't heal in isolation, and you don't have to carry any of this alone. This space isn't about staying in survival mode. It's about lifting ourselves out of the dimension that has tried to keep us trapped and choosing a version of ourselves that's still becoming. If this resonates with you, share with someone who might need a reminder or a friend. And make sure you're following the podcast so you don't miss the next episode. I'm JK. Stay open, stay self-curious, and remember, it's our time to thrive.